Welcome to Apricot Tree Academy's Dyslexia Awareness Month podcast series. This October, we're sharing real stories from parents, educators, and advocates whose lives have been shaped by dyslexia. We are here to share stories with families everywhere about how dyslexia is not a limitation. It's a difference in how the brain learns, and with the right tools, support, and understanding, every child can succeed. We're so glad you're here to listen, learn, and stand with us in spreading awareness and hope for all children with dyslexia.
Welcome to our Dyslexia Awareness Month podcast series. In today's episode, it's especially important because we are shifting the conversion from individual struggles to a bigger system at play in education. Our guest today is Debra Levy, a parent advocate with a legal background, years of experience helping families, and deep involvement in PTA and district level advocacy. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to speak with you. What I just want to kind of start out with, I know you talk about a lot about advocacy, but how did you first become involved with that advocacy?
Well, it's interesting. I think even from the time when I was learning how to read in school, when I was very young, I always asked myself, I never really understood because, when I was in elementary school, we had the little readers and we picked the SRAs, and I never understood why I was learning how to read and my peers were not. And why some of my friend, whatever, Sheen Camp, whatever his name was, back in the day, couldn't read. And it just mystified me. Like, we were all learning from the same teacher, we were reading the same books, and, kids giggle and laugh and make fun of other children when they can't do what they can do. And I always thought, well, what's up with this? And then, as I became an older kid, I tutored in Spanish, and I was always interested in education to some degree. And when I was in college, I went to the College of New Jersey, which is now Trenton State College in New Jersey. But I worked in the Learning Center, and we had a little orientation to dyslexia. She actually used the word dyslexia with us. And so I worked with all kinds of students. I worked with adult learners. I worked with inner city students. I worked with people who, kids, young adults who really had trouble reading. And same questions. I asked myself the same questions. Why is this? How could this possibly be? And then I had a good friend who was having difficulty with writing. And he confided to me that he had gone to a special needs school for high school, and he was dyslexic and dysgraphic. So I'd heard, so there again, I heard the word again, and I heard the word dysgraphia. So also taught high school for a little bit and had some kids with IEPs, although it was in a private setting. So that's kind of where my curiosity started. My kids, I still refer to them as my kids. I was a history teacher at the time, and they were pretty good at advocating for themselves and explaining to me, I can't read this assignment, I can't write, and all these things. So I was always curious about it. And then I attended Southern Methodist University and was studying really what we called then dyslexia therapy, or to become a certified academic language therapist, which I thought I would love. I thought I would build a little office on top of my garage and work with kids there. And then before that, I had gone to paralegal school. I was a history major, and I wanted to do something that was portable. And so I was a legal assistant. So I specialized in public law when I was in paralegal school. So, kind of fast forward, I had a son who, oddly, they told me they were in preschool, they were like, oh, he can read, but he can't write his name. And, I had gone to grad school for this. And so, like, tick, tick, ding, this little clock went off in my head, like, oh. So I picked up the phone and I called my advisor in my program, and I said, well, what do you think I should do? And she said, oh, so I live near Texas Scottish Rite, right? Put him on the list because they won't test him in school yet, right? And at that time they would not have. So turns out I have my first dyslexic child, and then I have a daughter who's also dyslexic, has dyslexia. So I became an advocate literally at that moment, right? I'd already gone to the school when I knew he was struggling. We didn't know what it was yet as he entered first grade. But I literally became an advocate when they sat across from me and told me, he's not failing. We don't do that. He's too young. We don't do this. And I And I looked around the room and I said, well, he falls under section 504. And my husband's like, it's a new law. I'm like, no, it's not. It's not. It's 1973, 1974. And the state had to, I didn't know we had dyslexia yet, but I knew that they couldn't just do nothing, right? And then when I found out he was dyslexic, I turned in my paperwork and they kept telling me, well, if it's developmental, then that means we can't do anything, and just all this crazy stuff. And so they told me, we wouldn't be here when we finally had the meeting on dyslexia. Well, we wouldn't be here because he's not failing. And they showed me what their program was, and it was literally like as if they had taken blocks of programs and put them together. And I told them, this is not a dyslexia program. The criteria in Texas law is not great, right? Texas law is not as robust as it is today. But I said, this is not good. But I'll give you a year because his processing speed is high and he's happy. I said, but in a year, he's not going to be happy. And I can work with him. I'll send him to camp in the summer, all of that. So that's when I became an advocate. I said, I'll give you a year to get something together. And apparently I wasn't the only person doing this in the district. And so that's partly when I became an advocate. And then if you fast forward, they brought in a program. They brought in the Texas Scottish Rite dyslexia tapes, which are ancient, but effective. And I had, so they came to me, my friends who also had children with this need, said, they're not doing this right. You need to go in and observe class, because they knew I had this background, and I did. I went in and observed, and I was like, oh no, they're not doing this right. And so I went to the district, and it turns out that Texas had passed a law recently, or regulation in the dyslexia code and in the handbooks that required them at the time to have a parents group. So they enlisted me as the complaining person, as one does, to lead a parents group. So that's really when I started working with the district, probably. But that's a long way of saying, I always had an interest in this, and then once I had the knowledge, I found it to be a necessity for my own child, but it was evident to me that it was a necessity for other children. I mean, some of my friends who wound up in the same cohort as my son, brought me their paperwork for whatever their kids were in. And I was looking, and I looked at it because, I take in diagnostics in grad school, and I'm looking at their paperwork, and I'm like, well, they completely missed this, right? You need to go back to them and tell them to look for dyslexia, right? So that's really, I've kind of been doing the same thing wherever I can for a long time.
Great. I find that interesting. A lot of people we talk to, they have a connection with their children first, and then it becomes, that way. But I find it interesting that you noticed it early on. That's really cool.
Early. I was sort of hyper, I wanted to read so badly when I was little. And I can remember thinking, like, my uncle's name is Michael, and I can remember thinking, like, there's no K in the middle of his name. Why is it spelled this way? I just was mystified, right? So I was always very into phonology, like all those weird things. I just thought about words and language all the time when I was a kid. So very weird, but
very cool.
But cool. And so and I believe really with all my heart that every child has a right to read. I just do. And we completely are doing a disservice to children in this country still.
Yeah, I know you and I talked before our meeting today about the systems that we have. Right. So and that they need to change. And so what does a true systems change look like for you when it comes to dyslexia?
So I also sort of had this background because I came from the legal world and the corporate world. So where you build systems inside of organizations, right? And you do things like strategic planning, and you have a vision for where you want to go. And so to me, this always represented, it shouldn't be that every person has to fight for their child and then something happens, right? It should be, there's a systemic solution to this. You have to build the capacity. Part of the problem that Texas had is they passed a law without any capacity. Some, when the good lawmakers of their day back in 1982 to 1984, those legislative sessions, really believed that you could say, okay, you need to test and you need to get a program together with these descriptors. They wouldn't say dyslexia program. They wouldn't say alphabet phonics. They wouldn't say or Gillingham. They wouldn't say that. They created, because, and in some ways I get that makes sense, but they created like, I don't know, 6 descriptors, right, that kind of flow along with what we know about the what good reading is, and the reading research at the time, right? And so that was good in some ways, but they thought, oh, if we do a program, oh, then surely kids will get what they need. And not true, because what we had was a system where everyone who had the knowledge to be a dyslexia instructor was a therapist that was trained through MSLEC, through SMU, or maybe they had done Texas, they could facilitate Texas Scottish Rights program as a paraprofessional, and that was the training that you needed. Or maybe they had done MTA, which is the multisensory teaching approach, which is a minimal amount of training in dyslexia. But they tried. In the beginning, they had dyslexia academies around the state. I mean, they were trying. But you kind of have the system working against you, because in schools of education, they don't teach reading. They don't teach dyslexia. They don't teach any of this, right? And so they do a little bit now, but so that's also part of the problem, right? You have people who literally had masters of reading. And my son was being pulled by the reading recovery teacher and was not making progress, right? Because they weren't doing the right thing. And, look, we've known since, I don't know, 1890, what to do for kids, maybe earlier. And so it's mystifying in a lot of ways. So the capacity issue was that they don't have enough people to do this. There's not the right training. And then within the district, you have people that don't believe it's real, right? I mean, we're literally dealing with administrators who didn't believe that dyslexia was a real thing. I had a principal tell me in the beginning, all kids learn how to read. They just don't learn to read at the same time. And, I didn't bite his head off. You're in a meeting, just in a regular meeting for the grade level. But I just thought, this is the attitude that people have, and they've had it for decades and for years. So the systemic part of it is really building, you find the people with the knowledge and you put them in the place where they need to be, and you support them, right? You advocate for the right people to be in a position of influence and of authentic instruction for dyslexia, right? And they get what's needed. And also, we can argue all day long about systems of accountability in education. About in Texas, it's the tax test, right? Or now it's the STAR. We've had all these testing, and the state's finally gotten rid of the STAR, and we're figuring out they're going to figure out what they're going to do next. But without that accountability, districts would not do what they're supposed to do for kids. They would not. If they had no accountability system, they would have no incentive to make sure a child can read, like really none, or to do the right thing for that child. So because accountability came online, and they were seeing like their scores weren't getting better, and there were kids that were never making, they were able to see, oh my gosh, this kid is not making progress. And we've taught them again, and they've been in reading recovery. What's going on? What are we doing wrong? And so they themselves kind of got to the point where they're like, oh wow, this works. They began to see, in the first generation of kids that went through with my son, they began to see this works. And the really funny thing is, in my house of worship, I have a very good friend who was dyslexic, and his mother also fought for him to get remediation. And back in the day, they used Herman. They used something completely different, but it was in special ed, and there was no dyslexia law. And then they just they don't have to identify it, so they don't look for it, and they don't do the right thing, and they don't have the training. So you really have to make sure, both inside the district and outside the district, and then as a matter of regulation, you have to build a system where there's trained people, knowledgeable people, and not just the people who are working directly with kids, but classroom teachers have to be able to recognize the characteristics of dyslexia, where they can refer. And then they can do, some people call it RTI, response to instruction. Some people call it multi-system, multi-tiered system of instruction. But those things help you see after a certain amount of time, this child is not getting it. But they do respond to this when I do this. So that gives you the evidence that you need. And it's really the training. It's training in every direction, really.
Yeah, it sounds like that's one of the key pieces we're missing is the training for educators, also even, parents, helping them understand that what to look for and things like that.
I mean, one of the first things we did is we actually we did programming for parents all across the district. What is dyslexia? How do you identify it? What program are we using? And we did other things like how can I help my child, right? What do I do about accommodations? Like, what does that mean? What are they? What's the difference between accommodations and modifications? What's the difference between 504 and special education, which is no longer an issue as much in Texas, because we've moved dyslexia from Section 504 regular education to special ed. And so, we did a lot of work like that. We also did technology training with parents. We did some of that with our regional center here. So there's just many aspects because parents don't know either. They don't recognize the symptoms, and they oftentimes will be doing things that, they're trying to be helpful, but are adding stress to the child. As well. So it's an all-encompassing, the Say Dyslexia campaign that Decoding Dyslexia ran and still talks about is very powerful. Like, let's just tell people what it is. Let's just be upfront and let people have the knowledge they need, So.
Yeah, I would love that, more of that, right? And so that's one of the reasons we're grateful you're here today, so we can spread some more awareness for dyslexia. Building on that, what advice do you have for parents who want to get more organized locally and don't know where to start?
So if you're in a district, if you find yourself, because I talk to people, I think it's how you and I met, I talk to people online often, and they're struggling with their child or their therapist that are struggling with with students even, and not really recognizing that they need to refer, right? Even parents don't realize that they need to refer their child for testing. But here's the deal. So many districts don't recognize that dyslexia is real. So you need to find other parents who are in the same boat. It's literally, I don't know what you guys did when you were waiting for your kids to come out of school, but we used to stand around and talk to each other, if you're able to do that. If not, PTA is a really good place to find parents also. In Texas, we're really all over the country. There is a special rubric that the PTA can have, a committee, and it's called a special and gifted education. It can either be a committee or it can be its own PTA. In my district, it's its own PTA. But I believe this is ubiquitous all over the PTA system. You can have this kind of committee. And what that committee is able to do is to do programming and education on special needs, giftedness, and gifted and talented, and help people understand what these things are, because PTA really is about all kids. So you can therefore be an advocate for all children, which includes students with disabilities. And then find your people, and then study the district, study the state laws, study federal laws, and learn how to advocate. So how do you do that? So I very well remember meeting with some parents about this at different times. And so the first thing you really do is you talk to each other, you tell each other your stories. It's storytelling. What was your story about discovering that your child had a special need? Who helped you? What were your struggles, right? Do you have similar struggles, similar roadblocks? And you might be able to see patterns based on what school you're in, what district you're in, if there's an administrator that seems to be problematic, or a program itself that's just not working for kids. Because I've seen all of that in my little career about this. So one of the things that you can do is begin to organize, and in the sense, learn about dyslexia yourselves. What resources does your state have? Many states now, I think we might be up to 25, 23, could be a little more, have passed dyslexia laws. They're all different, right? Some of them are only identification. Nothing is said about what kind of instruction you provide. Some are about screening, right? But find out to what extent it's a thing. Is it real? Do they have something? And then learn more. Find out who was behind that legislation, right? Even find out if they'll talk to you. Find and then start going to meetings. Go to the International Dyslexia Association meeting in your city. Go, even if it's online. Go find your people who understand dyslexia. Go see if there are academic language therapists who are licensed in your city, in your state. There's an organization called the Academic Language Therapy Association, or ALTA. They have a list of trained therapists all over the country, and they're headquartered in Texas. Everything began in Texas, I'll just say, in many ways. Even the the therapies and the programming we use today, a lot of it came out of Texas. Not to say it wasn't also Baltimore or Washington State. I mean, there are other hubs. There's always been hubs and satellites for dyslexia education and understanding, but Texas has had a huge influence. So look and see if anyone's there, depending on their skill level and their training, especially if they're a QI, which means they're a qualified instructor of dyslexia and trained teachers and are able to do that. They're going to be highly qualified and highly knowledgeable. Go talk to them, because they're going to know a lot that can help you, right? And so just first, you're in a storytelling, gather information phase. And then you need to really dig into, like, again, state law, federal law. Is the district doing what they're supposed to be doing? Did they do what they were supposed to do for your child? What's the process, right? Do they, and does someone do they know how to look for dyslexia, right? Maybe they need training. Maybe they need a grant. Maybe they need just a little help, right? And I always approach any advocacy situation that I'm in as being helpful. Like, how can I help you to get where you want to go? Because again, in order to figure out what you need to do, you have to have a vision of where you want to go. So, I literally said to some of the folks in my district, where do you want to be 10 years from now? And how can I help you get there? Because it's this is not going away. It's an issue. I think a lot of administrators, I wish these people would go away, and I wish this would go away. They just want to teach. Many people still have the reading wars sort of situation. You hear it all the time, like too much phonics, kids aren't reading literature. There's a lot of reasons kids aren't reading, right? And it's not just that they're being taught to read a different way. So, and then it also, when I talk about a system, it also has to do with the general ed reading program. What kind of programming is your district using? Do they have a balanced literacy philosophy? Are they using whole language as their philosophy, right? My understanding is that in California, they really kind of had a whole language philosophy for a long time, and that's changing. We've moved, when I started this, 28 years ago, we didn't have the word structured literacy, although we all kind of knew what it meant, like the practitioners knew what it meant. It was just a term of whatever. But now, the IDA has adopted this whole notion of structured literacy, and you hear it all the time in education. And this idea that you teach, that there's a sequence and a scope for teaching early reading, and it's structured literacy, right? And so are they doing that stuff? Are they measuring? What are their do they have early reading measures, right? In Texas, by law, they have to. They had to before, before any of this, some of the federal stuff came on but all of that came online. Like, everyone has DIBELS. Now they use MAP as well. Like, they're all testing to see how this child is developing. Find out about that. because it's very interesting because you can see if a child is flatlining in these measures. And very often I find that schools have the data that they need to intervene, and they aren't doing it unless you raise your concerns. They don't always come to you, although if they get better and better at their own systems, they do, so.
I think that's all great advice. One of the things that you touched on was finding your people. You said that a couple of times. I think that's great because a lot of us people, when we get together, we just love to talk about it, and we want to help each other. Like there is some unity there. So I love that. And you talked a lot about IDA, which is the International Dyslexia Association for our listeners.
Yes.
And that, I think on that website, they have a lot of information about laws for different states and what is there. So when you start to do your research, that is a valuable tool. So I just put parent.
Exactly. And understood.org is also excellent. And there's also the Learning Disabilities Association. Understood, at least when they started out, was kind of an offshoot of that, I think. But they all have great resources of information. In Texas, if you are in Texas and you're listening to this, we have the Dyslexia Handbook, which is an incredible document. It's been through multiple generations and iterations as our laws have evolved and changed, but it is literally the Bible of dyslexia for anyone. And I know, I'm not sure that our state loves other people downloading it, but it is fantastic. If you're in a different state, Google it, Texas Dyslexia Handbook. It's an incredible resource. It lists tons of research, tons of information about how you find dyslexia and the systematic work that needs to be done to help that child, and suggest accommodations, just all of it. Identification systems are going to be different in every state, perhaps, maybe not necessarily, but the basic premise of testing and what they're looking for is going to be the same or similar. They may use different testing batteries, but it will also give you an idea of what they should be looking at. There's buckets of reading skills that they should be looking at, right? So absolutely, go to that. Texas also was sort of told that it needed to have a resource for parents, and it's called SPEDTX. So SPEDTX. And it has tons of information about every disability, including dyslexia, that you might want to know about. And it's a wonderful, wonderful resource. Though in this environment of budget cuts and education department situation that we have, there is sort of a diminishing aspect of feeling like there's a lot of protection. There may be in the future diminishing protections for kids, right? Because they've already consolidated grants for special needs kids, reduced funding in some cases, especially for people who are deaf and blind. That happened last week. There's a lot, it's just shifting. It's a quicksand sort of situation here, but the federal government supports a network of parent resource centers. And so it's a parent resource network, and you can Google it and go find in your state and because states are big, and they're different. Like Texas has a bunch of different ones. You have to figure out which one is in your region, but you can find these all over the country, and they are super helpful people and can also help you. Once you kind of have your information, you should look at, how do I advocate? What is advocacy? And advocacy is really thinking about power. Who has power? What do I need? What level of power do I need to appeal to? Right? Is it the district administrator? Is it the board? Is it my teacher? Is it my principal? Is really thinking about that and thinking about what needs to change, and then figuring out, how do I appeal to the people who are in power? What is the best campaign for me to undertake in order to change things? And there's lots of good resources on advocacy.
Great, thank you. I hopefully some of our listeners can reach out and get some of those or look at some of those resources, and we may put some of them in our show notes as well, so they can find them easier.
Great.
As we wrap up, I want to finish with this question: what gives you hope that change is possible in this space?
It's interesting. I think we're at an interesting time, partly because I think it's a time to be very vigilant because of changes that are going on. I mean, as you know, we moved dyslexia into special education in Texas, but for most states have always had it in special education. When we created our law, it was a deliberate situation that we put it under 504 because there was a discrepancy test for special education to qualify. Children with dyslexia very, very often did not meet criteria for special education because they learn how to compensate, especially depending on age. It's a wait to fail scenario if you're using a discrepancy method, right? And you don't want to wait to fail. The brain is growing and changing, and you want to catch this early. So we had a brilliant lawmaker and a special education board, school board member eventually, who, through her own personal experience and knowledge, got this law passed, and knew that it needed to be in general ed because these kids would never receive help there. So many states still may be using a method for identifying kids that is missing kids. So that's the other thing one should check is how do they identify kids? Federal law says you have to use a variety of evidence. You have to have a committee, but you also cannot use a pure discrepancy test any longer. You have to look at strengths and weaknesses and other patterns, right? So you need to find out what your district is doing too as part of all of this. But in terms of what we have to look forward to, we have to look forward to the fact that, technology cannot remediate a child completely, but technology makes it extremely powerful for someone to see that a child is struggling, right? Because, children are being, let's say if a child is struggling in phonemic awareness or even just the interest in reading at all, there's a lot of programming out there that they get some instruction and also testing through automation, through computers, and they can be tracked. You can see where their skills are. You can see, oh my gosh, they did this, they did this 10 times and they're always getting this wrong. Like, look at this pattern. So people, and I've even heard teachers say, I'm able to look at all this data. So data is our friend. People are always, I hear how parents are so afraid. Data is your friend. It's 100% your friend. It's how they use data, and it's how they're making the kids feel about testing that is the issue, right? And the hyper concern that's out there, especially if you have a kid with a disability. They're going to have a lot of concern about overly being tested all the time. You get scared, right? But data is our friend. So that's one thing. The other thing that gives me hope is just that it's, people know that to talk about it more, right? I mean, people talk about being dyslexic. I just was listening to a podcast where Governor Newsom was talking, and he talks about it. He talks about being a dyslexic person with dyslexia. And so that's a source of hope, right? But the other thing is that I'm not entirely hopeful right now. I mean, the IDA is looking at changing the definition of dyslexia to make it's a bit broader in definition. And I don't know how this has happened yet, or if they're still just talking about it. I have to go do more research on that. But, the confusing people in the middle of a stream, I don't like that very much. But also because of what's going on with education right now, I'm very concerned. I mean, there's this whole, I believe that private schools are great for our kids sometimes. If it fits, it's the right thing at the right time. But private schools on the whole are not equipped to remediate dyslexia. And we're headed into this headwind of literally privatizing public schools. There's this whole grant process that the Department of Education is like pushing out, where they're going to give more money to charter schools and private schools. And that's, for our kids, it's dangerous. And I think a lot of times unaware parents will think it's a better fit for their kids. just because it's a smaller, oh, the teachers are better, they know. And it's not necessarily true, because specialized instruction is exactly what dyslexia instruction is. So that, again, you have to have the same system. So you have to look at, where's the system, right? And are they going to do what my child needs? Because they are not required to under federal law. There simply is no requirement in a private school to test at certain times, to uncover dyslexia, to tell you, to screen. We just passed a voucher bill in Texas. There's no requirement that private schools screen for early reading problems. None, zero, exactly zero. So it's a it's a mystique that private schools have, but many times I find, and I'm saying this as a parent who moved a child to private school at a certain period in their lives because they needed it, right? Not because the school wasn't trying, but the kid was like just not in a position to be very cooperative. It was the teenage years, right? So so you had to do what you had to do, and it was a school that was equipped. We were able to do that here because there's very many in our area. But even so, they didn't have similar, it wasn't like apples to apples, right? So I think it's just really important that parents really understand, what is it my child needs, and be willing to do that. The other thing, given that we're all going to go into this is what's happening. Schools are required to child find. If there's one thing everyone should know when they leave this, is it's called child find, and it's called child find mandate. Every school in this country has a 3 to, like, I think it's 21, to be honest, child find mandate, or at least it's through 12th grade. And that means if there's a suspicion that a child has a disability, they are required to investigate and figure out, do we need to test? Do we need to find out what's going on? Private schools have no such mandate. And that child find mandate is very powerful all through a child's education. Even once they're identified, it's powerful. So.
Well, thank you, Deborah, for sharing your expertise and your experience, and for encouraging our listeners to go out and do research and get connected and figure out how they can advocate for not just their own children, but for all children. So thank you for being here with us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate all that you're doing yourselves in your own lives. And
well, thank you.
Others. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I really appreciate it.
Right. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for another story in Apricot Tree Academy's Dyslexia Awareness Month podcast series. We hope today's conversation helped you feel seen, inspired, and reminded that no family is alone on this journey. Every story shared brings us one step closer to better understanding, better support, and brighter futures for children with dyslexia. If you'd like to learn more about how to support your child at home, visit apricottreeacademy.com for free resources, parent guides, and our dyslexia intervention curriculum designed especially for families. And if this episode resonated with you, please share it with another parent or educator who could use some encouragement today. Together, we can raise awareness, change perceptions, and empower every child to reach their full potential.